The winter wind blew hard across the high mountain valley of Colorado. It was the year 1886, and the snow fell in relentless sheets, burying the small mining town of Silverton under a thick white blanket. The sun had set hours ago, leaving the streets in deep darkness, save for the occasional flicker of a kerosene lamp hanging from a wooden post. Most of the townspeople had already retreated to the warmth of their hearths, locking their doors against the bitter mountain air that rattled the wooden window frames and whistled through the gaps in the timber walls. The carriage from the lower plains had barely made it through the mountain pass, its heavy wooden wheels groaning under the weight of the ice as it finally came to a halt near the deserted station. Hazel Green stepped down from the carriage, her boots sinking deep into the fresh snow. She was 26 years old, but the exhaustion of the past months made her feel much older. She wrapped her thin, worn woolen shawl tightly around her shoulders, her fingers numb from the biting cold that seemed to seep right through her clothes. Only a few months ago, her life had been filled with warmth and stability, but a sudden fever had taken her husband, leaving her completely vulnerable. Before she could even process her grief, his greedy brothers, Jared and Luke, had taken control of the small farm and the house, leaving her with nothing but a single, battered suitcase and a handful of coins that had quickly vanished during her long journey. She stood on the frozen platform, watching the other passengers quickly disappear into the shadows of the nearby streets, eager to reach their families. Hazel took a deep breath and began to walk toward the center of the town, hoping to find someone willing to offer her a warm place to rest for the night. She knocked on the heavy oak door of the local boarding house, but the owner merely looked at her worn coat through the window and shook her head, refusing to open the latch. She tried the town tavern, but the barkeep told her they had no rooms for travelers who could not pay in advance, showing her no sympathy as he ushered her back out into the freezing night air. With her hope fading as fast as her physical strength, Hazel sat down on a cold wooden bench near the town square, her body shaking violently from the cold. She pulled her knees close to her chest, staring at the empty streets, while the snow began to accumulate on her dark hair. It was at that moment, when the silence of the night felt almost complete, that a large, dark shadow fell over her. She slowly lifted her head, expecting to see a hostile townsperson telling her to move along, but instead, she found herself looking up at a figure that seemed to belong to the mountain itself. The man standing before her was exceptionally tall, with a quiet, commanding presence that made the wind seem to die down around him. His hair was as white as the fresh snow, falling in soft waves around his face, and his skin was pale, almost like polished white stone in the moonlight. His eyes were deep and unusually calm, watching her with a gentle intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. This was Lawrence Gray, the mysterious owner of the valley's largest timber mill, whom the locals whispered about in hushed tones, calling him a vampire, and warning their children to never wander near his dark stone estate. Lawrence looked down at her shivering form, his expression unreadable but entirely devoid of the coldness she had encountered from the others. "You will not survive the night if you stay on this bench," he said, his voice deep, cool, and surprisingly smooth. He did not sound like the monster the townspeople described. Instead, his words carried a strange, comforting melody. Hazel looked into his pale face, sensing no danger in his presence, only a quiet strength that made her feel oddly warm despite the freezing air. "I have nowhere else to go," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustle of the wind. "I have no money to pay for a room." Without a word of complaint or hesitation, Lawrence reached down and picked up her heavy wooden suitcase, lifting it as though it were as light as a feather. "I have a small, empty cottage at the southern edge of my property," he said, turning his gaze back toward the dark pine forest that bordered the town. "It is simple, but it is dry and warm. You may stay there for as long as you need, and you do not owe me anything for the shelter." Hazel stood up, her legs trembling as she took a step toward him, wondering why this feared stranger was the only person in the entire valley to show her a shred of human kindness. She followed him through the quiet, snow-covered paths that led away from the town and into the deep silence of the pine woods. The tall trees sheltered them from the worst of the wind, and within half an hour they arrived at a small, sturdy cabin made of thick logs. Lawrence stepped inside, quickly lighting a fire in the cast-iron stove and placing a fresh supply of dry pine logs beside the hearth. He set her suitcase down near the small bed, then turned to leave, his white hair catching the warm amber glow of the fire. "Thank you," Hazel said softly, and as Lawrence gave a gentle nod before disappearing back into the dark night, she realized that she finally felt safe. As the weeks passed, the bitter winter slowly began to lose its hold on the mountain valley, allowing the thick blankets of snow to melt into rushing streams of clear water. Hazel refused to be a burden to the man who had saved her life, and she was determined to earn her keep on the estate. The morning after her arrival, she walked up the stone pathway to the timber mill's office and introduced herself to Mr. Higgins, the elderly clerk who managed the daily business of the timber mill. She offered to help with any work that needed to be done, from cleaning the office to organizing the messy piles of paperwork that sat on the wooden desks. Mr. Higgins was delighted to have her help, especially when he saw her neat, precise handwriting and her quick understanding of numbers. Within a short time, Hazel was spending her mornings sorting through the shipping invoices, tracking the delivery of timber to the neighboring towns, and keeping the daily wage logs for the workers. She found a deep sense of peace in the quiet routine of the office, and the work gave her a feeling of independence that she thought she had lost forever. Each day, she felt more at home in the small cabin, knowing that she was contributing to the estate that had sheltered her. Despite her growing comfort, Hazel could not help but notice the strange habits of her benefactor, who remained a mystery to the rest of the valley. Lawrence Gray was rarely seen during the bright daylight hours, choosing to remain inside the cool, shaded rooms of the massive stone house at the top of the hill. The mill workers often spoke of him in low voices, trading stories about his pale skin and his legendary strength. But Hazel noticed that none of them had ever actually seen him do anything harmful. In fact, the more she observed the estate, the more she realized that Lawrence's quiet presence brought a sense of order and safety to everyone who lived there. One bright morning, a loud commotion broke out near the main stables, drawing Hazel away from her desk to see what was happening. A young mill hand had just ridden into the yard, leading a beautiful black mare that was limping heavily and breathing in rapid, shallow gasps of pain. The horse's left front leg was bleeding from a deep cut where she had fallen on the sharp mountain rocks, and she was trembling so hard she could barely stand. Several of the workers gathered around the animal, shaking their heads in pity as they discussed what should be done. "Her leg is badly damaged," the stable master said, reaching for his rifle with a grim expression on his weathered face. "There is no way to save a horse with an injury like that in these mountains. It is best to end her suffering now before she gets any worse." Hazel felt a wave of sadness wash over her as she looked at the beautiful mare's frightened eyes. But before anyone could raise a hand, a quiet voice spoke from the shadow of the barn door. Lawrence had appeared, his tall figure casting a long shadow across the dusty yard, his white hair shining in the dim light of the stable entry. The workers immediately stepped back, lowering their voices as Lawrence walked toward the injured horse, with calm, deliberate steps. He knelt in the damp straw next to the trembling animal, placing one of his pale, cool hands gently against her neck, while whispering words that only the horse could hear. Within seconds, the mare stopped thrashing, her heavy breathing slowing down as she leaned her head against his shoulder, seemingly calmed by his very touch. Lawrence examined the leg with extreme care, his fingers moving gently over the wound to check the bone beneath the torn skin. "She will live," Lawrence said firmly, his eyes looking up at the stable master with an intensity that brooked no argument. "Bring me clean, warm water, fresh bandages, and the healing herbs from the pantry in the house. We are not going to lose her today." For the next several hours, Lawrence remained in the dusty stable, cleaning the deep wound himself and carefully wrapping the leg to support the cracked bone. Hazel watched from the doorway, deeply moved by the sight of this powerful man, whom the town feared as a monster, spending his day on his knees in the straw, to save a helpless animal. Over the following weeks, Lawrence visited the stable every morning before the sun rose, and every evening after it set, personally changing the bandages and making sure the mare was comfortable. By the time the first green shoots of grass began to appear on the hillsides, the black horse was walking around the pasture on her own, her leg healed and her strength fully restored. The sight of the mare running in the morning sun stayed with Hazel, serving as a constant reminder of the deep compassion that lay beneath Lawrence's cold, mysterious exterior. The arrival of spring did not mean the mountain storms were entirely over, as the high peaks of Colorado often held onto the winter cold long after the valleys had turned green. One afternoon, a fierce and unexpected blizzard swept down from the summit, catching the workers by surprise and turning the entire landscape into a blinding sheet of white within minutes. The wind howled through the canyons like a wild beast, tearing branches from the pine trees and making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet in front of oneself. Hazel sat inside her cozy cottage, keeping the fire in her stove burning brightly, though she felt a growing sense of unease as the storm grew more violent. Her worries were confirmed when she heard a frantic knocking at her door, and she opened it to find young Billy, the 14-year-old stable helper, shivering on her porch with snow covering his hat. "Miss Hazel, we have a terrible problem," the boy said, his teeth chattering so hard he could barely form the words. A newborn calf got separated from its mother in the lower pasture just before the wind picked up, and it is out there all alone in the freezing cold. Hazel felt a cold dread settle in her stomach, knowing that a young animal would not survive more than an hour in such a severe storm. "Did anyone go after it?" Hazel asked, wrapping her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she looked out at the swirling white darkness. Billy nodded quickly, his eyes wide with concern. "Mr. Gray went out on foot as soon as I told him about the calf. He wouldn't let any of the other men go because he said the wind was too dangerous for them." Hazel's heart pounded against her ribs at the thought of Lawrence out in the freezing whiteout, where the temperature was rapidly dropping and the paths were completely covered by deep drifts of snow. She thanked Billy and sent him back to the main bunkhouse, promising to keep a lookout from her window in case Lawrence needed help. For the next 3 hours, Hazel could do nothing but pace the wooden floor of her small cabin, her eyes constantly turning toward the window where the lantern light struggled to pierce the thick gloom. She added more logs to her stove, keeping the small room as warm as possible, and prepared a pot of hot water, praying that the man with the white hair would find his way back to safety. The sheer force of the storm rattled the log walls, making her realize how easily even the strongest man could be overcome by the freezing cold. It was nearly 9 o'clock in the evening when she finally heard the heavy thump of boots on her porch, followed by the latch of her door lifting. Lawrence stepped into the cabin, a gust of freezing wind and snow rushing in behind him before he quickly kicked the door shut. He was covered in ice from head to toe, his white hair frozen into pale spikes against his forehead, and his cheeks were pale and cold as marble. Yet, despite the freezing air clinging to his dark coat, his focus was entirely on the small bundle cradled gently in his massive, pale arms. He had wrapped his own heavy wool scarf around the tiny, shivering calf, which was breathing weakly but was still very much alive. Lawrence knelt carefully on the wooden floor next to the warm stove, gently laying the young animal down on the floorboards as he began to rub its cold limbs to restore its circulation. Hazel did not hesitate. She rushed to her cupboard to grab several dry, warm blankets and knelt down in the straw-flecked dust beside him, her hands working alongside his to save the tiny creature. "We must keep him warm," Lawrence murmured, his breath coming in slow, pale mists as he looked down at the calf with a look of intense, quiet relief. As Hazel worked to wrap the dry blankets around the animal, her fingers brushed against Lawrence's pale hands, and she was surprised by how cold they felt, like ice from the deepest mountain spring. Yet, his touch remained incredibly gentle as he held the calf's head, helping it drink a small bowl of warm milk that Hazel had prepared on the stove. Together they worked in the quiet cabin for nearly an hour, until the calf finally let out a soft, healthy sound and began to lift its head. Once he was certain the young animal would survive the night, Lawrence stood up, his tall frame nearly reaching the wooden rafters of the small cabin. He looked down at Hazel, his dark eyes softening with a quiet gratitude that warmed her more than the heat from the iron stove. "Thank you for your help, Hazel," he said softly, his voice carrying a deep sincerity that touched her heart. As he stepped back out into the fading storm, to return the calf to its mother, Hazel sat by the fire, realizing that Lawrence's strength was not something to be feared, but a shield that protected every living thing under his care. The spring season soon took full possession of the mountain valley, turning the brown hills into vibrant fields of green and filling the air with the sweet scent of blooming wildflowers. Hazel traveled into the town of Silverton one sunny afternoon to purchase a fresh supply of salt, sugar, and writing paper for her work in the timber office. The town was busy with activity, as miners and ranchers from the surrounding hills had come to buy provisions after being snowed in for so many months. She enjoyed the lively atmosphere, but she remained quiet, keeping her eyes downcast to avoid the curious stares of the locals who still whispered about her living on the Gray estate. While walking down the main street, she decided to stop by the office of Dr. Miller, the town's only physician, to pick up a small bottle of soothing liniment for Mr. Higgins' aching hands. As she stepped inside the quiet waiting room, she could hear the doctor speaking in a low voice to his young apprentice in the back room. She did not mean to eavesdrop, but the mention of a poor family living near the old abandoned mine caught her attention. "The young Davis boy is going to recover," the doctor said, his voice filled with relief. "The fever has finally broken, and the mother can afford the proper food he needs." The apprentice sounded completely puzzled by the news. "But Mrs. Davis has been struggling to pay her rent for months. How did she find the money for such expensive Denver medicine?" Dr. Miller chuckled softly, a sound of warm familiarity in his voice. "She did not find it. Someone left a heavy pouch of old silver coins on my doorstep late last night, with a simple note asking me to care for the boy. I know those coins well, as they are the very same ones that have paid for the medicine of every poor child in this valley for the last 30 years. Hazel felt a quiet warmth bloom in her chest as she listened to the doctor's words, knowing immediately that the anonymous benefactor was none other than Lawrence Gray. She quietly paid for Mr. Higgins' medicine and left the office, her mind filled with the image of the pale-skinned man who stayed in the shadows of his stone house, yet brought so much light into the lives of others. It was clear to her that Lawrence did not seek the approval of the townspeople, nor did he care about his own reputation. He simply cared about the well-being of the community that feared him. Her curiosity about Lawrence's quiet nighttime activities led her to stay awake late into the night a few days later, sitting by her darkened window to watch the main path. Around midnight, she saw the large wooden supply wagon roll quietly out of the stables, its lantern unlit to avoid drawing attention. Lawrence was sitting on the wooden bench, his white hair catching the faint starlight, as he guided the two large horses toward the road that led to the poorer settlements. Hazel quickly put on her dark shawl and slipped out into the cool night air, determined to see where he was going. She followed the wagon at a safe distance, keeping herself hidden within the deep shadows of the pine trees that lined the mountain path. The only sound in the quiet valley was the soft crunch of the wagon wheels on the damp dirt road, and the occasional hoot of a night owl high in the branches. Lawrence drove the wagon with expert skill, eventually stopping near a small, run-down cabin where an elderly widow lived alone. Hazel watched from behind a large rock as Lawrence climbed down from the seat, his movements swift and silent in the dark. He lifted a heavy sack of flour and a large bundle of dry firewood from the back of the wagon, placing them gently on the widow's front porch without making a single sound. He did not knock on the door or wait for a thank you. He simply stood there for a brief moment, ensuring the package was safe from the wind, before returning to his wagon and driving toward the next cabin. Hazel watched him repeat this act of quiet generosity at several other homes throughout the valley, leaving food, blankets, and supplies for those who were struggling to survive the aftermath of the long winter. As she walked back to her cottage in the quiet hours before dawn, Hazel felt a deep, sincere respect for the man who ruled the mountain. He was a king who did not demand tribute from his subjects, but instead spent his nights serving them in secret, asking for nothing but their safety in return. The contrast between the townspeople's fearful whispers and the reality of Lawrence's selfless heart made her realize how truly special he was. She knew that she was falling deeply in love with him, and she resolved to show him that there was at least one person in the world who saw him for who he truly was. As the summer months brought warm, dry air to the high country, the evenings became the most beautiful part of the day in the mountain valley. The hot sun would dip behind the jagged western peaks, painting the sky in deep shades of gold and purple, before leaving the valley in the cool, starlit embrace of the night. It was during these quiet hours that Hazel and Lawrence began to spend more time together, sitting on the wide stone terrace behind the main house. The hum of crickets in the nearby fields and the soft rustle of the pine needles created a peaceful melody that seemed to ease the tension between them. At first, their conversations had been brief and focused entirely on the business of the timber mill, but gradually they began to speak of more personal things. Hazel found herself looking forward to these evening chats, sitting in a wooden rocker while Lawrence sat in the shadows of the stone wall, his white hair catching the silver glow of the moon. She would tell him about her childhood in the green hills of the east, and he would listen with quiet attention, his dark eyes reflecting the light of the stars, as though he were memorizing every word she spoke. One evening, as the night breeze carried the scent of sweet grass, Hazel gathered the courage to ask him about his own past, which had remained a mystery to her. "You have built a great empire here, Lawrence, but you rarely speak of your own family," she said softly, watching him closely. Lawrence stared out at the dark silhouette of the mountains, his pale face looking like carved marble in the moonlight. "I have no family left, Hazel," he said, his voice carrying a quiet sadness that touched her heart. "My parents passed away a very long time ago, before this town was even a mark on a map." "Did you never wish to have a family of your own?" Hazel asked, her voice gentle and encouraging. Lawrence was silent for a long moment, his long, pale fingers resting on the arm of his chair. "I did," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I realized early on that my path was different from others. The people of this valley see me as a creature of the night, a phantom to be feared. It would have been unfair to bring anyone into a life of isolation and whispers, to force them to share the burden of my shadows." Hazel looked at his striking features, his white hair contrasting sharply with his dark coat, and his skin that seemed almost luminous under the starlight. She did not see a monster or a phantom. She saw a man who had lived 100 lifetimes of loneliness, yet had never allowed his heart to grow cold or bitter. "The people in town do not know you, Lawrence," she said, leaning forward in her chair. "They only see what they want to see. But I have seen your heart, and it is the kindest, most generous heart I have ever known." Lawrence looked at her, his eyes shining with a strange, intense light that made her heart beat faster in her chest. "You are kind to say so, Hazel, but you are a creature of the sun, and I belong to the dark," he said, his voice thick with a conflict he could not hide. "I do not age as you do, and my skin is cold to the touch. I am a creature of the night, and my world is a lonely one." He seemed to be warning her, trying to remind her of the vast distance that lay between a mortal woman and a vampire. But Hazel was not deterred by his words. She stood up and walked across the stone terrace, stopping right in front of his chair. She reached out and placed her warm hand gently over his pale, cool fingers, refusing to let him pull away. "I do not care about the sun or the dark, Lawrence," she said, looking directly into his deep eyes. "And I do not care about the old stories. I only care about the man who stands before me, the man who saved me when I was lost, and has protected me ever since." Lawrence stared at their joined hands, his fingers trembling slightly under the warmth of her touch, as though he had forgotten what human warmth felt like. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to hold her hand, feeling a deep, overwhelming love for her that he had tried so hard to bury. But the fear of bringing her pain was still too strong, and he gently released her hand, standing up to look out at the dark forest. "It is late, Hazel," he said quietly, his voice full of a tender regret. "You should rest." Hazel watched him walk back into the shadows of the stone house, knowing that while he had pulled away, his heart was already hers. The heat of late summer hung heavy over the mountain valley, drying the mountain paths and turning the high pastures into shades of gold. Hazel traveled into the town of Silverton on a warm Tuesday afternoon, intending to deliver some completed accounting ledgers to the shipping office and pick up some fresh coffee. The main street was crowded with wagons and horses, and the sidewalks were filled with people going about their daily business. As Hazel stepped off the wooden porch of the general store, her eyes caught sight of two men standing near the town well, their dusty coats and rough faces instantly making her freeze in her tracks. They were Jared and Luke Green, her late husband's brothers, the very men who had stripped her of her home and left her to freeze in the winter storm. They looked older and more weathered than she remembered, but their eyes held the same cold, greedy look that had haunted her dreams for months. Hazel tried to turn back toward the store, hoping to avoid their gaze, but Jared had already spotted her, a cruel and predatory smile spreading across his thin lips. He tapped his brother's shoulder, and the two of them quickly strode across the dusty street, blocking her path before she could escape. Well, if it isn't our dear sister-in-law," Jared said, his voice loud and rough, drawing the attention of several nearby townspeople. "We have been looking for you for a very long time, Hazel, and we didn't expect to find you hiding out in this little mountain town." Hazel clutched her wooden ledger box tightly to her chest, her knuckles turning white as she tried to keep her voice steady. "I am not hiding, Jared," she said, looking him in the eye. "You took everything I owned back home. I have nothing more to give you." Luke let out a harsh laugh, stepping closer until she could smell the sour whiskey on his breath. "You took our brother's personal savings before you ran off, Hazel, and we are here to collect what belongs to our family," he lied, his fingers twitching near the pocket of his coat. $50 is what you owe us, and we are not leaving this valley until we have every single penny of it." Hazel's stomach tightened with a familiar terror, knowing that they were simply trying to extort money from her, but she also knew that the law in these remote towns often favored the loud and aggressive. Over the next 3 days, the brothers spread their poison throughout the small town of Silverton, visiting every tavern, boarding house, and shop to tell their false stories. They claimed that Hazel was a thief who had stolen from her husband's deathbed, and that she was now hiding under the protection of the Pale King on his estate to avoid her debts. The townspeople, who were always eager for gossip, quickly forgot the quiet, hard-working woman who had spent months balancing their mill records and began to look at her with suspicion and hostility. When Hazel walked down the main street of town to deliver her weekly reports, she could feel the weight of their cold stares and the sharp sting of their whispered comments. A merchant who had always been friendly to her suddenly claimed he had no flour to sell her, and the women at the boarding house turned their heads away when she passed by. The small, peaceful life she had worked so hard to build was beginning to crumble under the weight of the brothers' lies, and she felt a deep, crushing loneliness returning to her heart. She spent her evenings sitting alone in her small cabin, staring at the dark wooden walls and listening to the wind sighing through the pine trees outside. The fear of being cast out once again, of losing her safety and her home, made her feel as vulnerable as she had on that freezing night in the town square. She wondered if her happiness on the estate had only been a temporary dream, a brief pause before the harsh reality of her life caught up with her again. She did not want to leave Lawrence, but she feared that her presence would only bring trouble to his peaceful domain. She did not tell Lawrence about the brothers' threats, not wishing to worry him or draw him into her personal troubles, but she could not hide the sadness in her eyes. When she worked in the timber office, Mr. Higgins noticed her distraction and her pale face, but she merely offered him a sad smile and assured him she was fine. Yet, deep down, she knew that a confrontation was coming, and she feared that this time she would not have the strength to stand against the storm that was gathering around her. The final confrontation came on a hot Friday afternoon, when the air was thick with the scent of dry pine and dust. Hazel was in the middle of loading a box of ledgers and office supplies into the back of the timber wagon parked near the town square, when Jared and Luke stepped out from the shadow of the blacksmith shop. Their faces were dark with anger, and they blocked her path to the wagon, their heavy boots kicking up clouds of dust as they stepped closer. A crowd of townspeople quickly gathered, sensing that a fight was about to break out, and they watched from a distance with eager curiosity. "We are tired of playing games with you, Hazel," Jared shouted, his voice echoing across the quiet street and drawing even more onlookers from the shops. "You are going to pay us what you owe our family today, or we are going to drag you to the sheriff ourselves and make sure you spend the winter in a jail cell." Hazel stood her ground, though her hands trembled as she held her wooden box. "I have told you 100 times, Jared. I do not have $50, and I never stole a single penny from your brother." Luke let out a growl, stepping forward and grabbing her right arm with a rough, heavy hand, his fingers squeezing tight enough to leave dark bruises on her skin. "You are coming with us, then," he sneered, trying to pull her away from the wagon. Hazel struggled against his grip, trying to break free, but she was outnumbered and outmatched by his physical strength. She looked around the circle of townspeople, her eyes pleading for help, but none of them moved a muscle. They stood in silent hesitation, unwilling to step in and help a friendless widow. "Let her go," a deep, cool voice commanded from the edge of the square. The crowd parted instantly, a collective gasp rising from the onlookers as Lawrence Gray walked into the bright afternoon sun. He did not wear a hat to shield himself from the light, and his white hair seemed to catch the sun, looking like a halo of silver around his pale, sculpted face. His dark eyes were fixed on Luke's hand, carrying a quiet, freezing fury that made the hot summer air feel suddenly cold. He walked with slow, deliberate steps, his tall figure commanding the space around him with a powerful presence that made everyone in the square hold their breath. Luke looked at the tall, pale man and felt his confidence instantly vanish, his hand beginning to shake as Lawrence stopped only a few feet away. "This is family business, mister," Luke stammered, his voice losing its rough edge. "You have no right to interfere." Lawrence did not raise his voice, but when he spoke, his words carried the weight of a king. "The moment you laid a hand on her, it became my business. I will not ask you again. Remove your hand from her arm." Luke immediately released Hazel and took a hasty step back, his face turning pale. Jared tried to find his courage, stepping forward with his chest puffed out, though his legs were trembling. "She owes our family $50, and we have a right to our money." Lawrence reached into his dark wool coat, his movements swift and graceful, and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. He tossed it at Jared's feet, the sound of heavy silver coins clinking loudly against the dry dirt of the road. "There are $100 in that bag," Lawrence said, his eyes narrowing as he looked down at them. "Double what you claim she owes. Now, listen to me very carefully," Lawrence continued, his voice dropping to a low, powerful tone that made even the horses in the street grow quiet. "You will take that money, you will get on your horses, and you will leave this mountain valley today. If I ever see your faces in this town again, or if you ever speak her name, you will answer to me, and I assure you that you will not survive that meeting." The strange power in his voice was unmistakable, a dark force that left no doubt that he was indeed the king of the mountain. Jared quickly knelt and snatched up the leather bag, his fingers shaking as he stuffed it into his pocket. The brothers did not say another word. They turned and ran down the street, their horses quickly galloping away toward the pass. The town square remained completely silent as the townspeople looked at Lawrence, then at Hazel, finally realizing that the man they feared was a protector of the weak. Lawrence turned to Hazel, his pale face instantly softening as he looked at her bruised arm. "Are you all right, Hazel?" he asked gently, and as she nodded through her tears, she knew that she would never let him walk in the shadows alone again. The following Sunday, the small wooden chapel at the edge of Silverton was filled to capacity. The morning sun was bright and warm, casting colorful beams of light through the stained glass windows onto the polished wooden pews. The townspeople sat quietly, their minds filled with the events of the previous Friday, and their eyes constantly turning toward the back row where Lawrence Gray sat. He had arrived quietly, wearing a clean, dark coat that made his white hair look even more striking. He kept his head down, not wishing to draw attention to himself, but he remained a powerful presence in the room. When the service ended, the congregation slowly streamed out into the grassy churchyard, enjoying the warm mountain breeze and the company of their neighbors. Hazel waited near the steps, her heart beating fast, but her mind completely made up. As she saw Lawrence walk out into the shade of the large oak tree, she walked purposefully toward him, ignoring the curious glances of the crowd. The townspeople gradually noticed her movement, and their conversations died down until a complete silence fell over the yard. Hazel stood directly in front of Lawrence, looking up into his pale face and his deep, dark eyes. "Lawrence," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the quiet yard so that everyone could hear. "When I came to this town, I was a stranger with nothing but a broken heart and a cold future. You did not know me, yet you gave me a warm home, food, and a purpose when everyone else in this valley turned me away. I want everyone here to know the truth about the man they have feared for so long." She took a step closer, her eyes shining with tears of gratitude and love. "I have seen you save the injured horse when others wanted to end her life. I saw you carry the cold colt through a freezing blizzard, risking your own safety. I know you are the one who leaves food on the porches of the hungry and pays for the medicine of sick children in secret. You have lived in the shadows because you believed you were too different to be loved, but you are the most honorable man I have ever known." She reached out and took his pale, cool hand in hers, holding it tightly in front of the entire congregation. "You protected me from danger when nobody else would step forward. You are my home, Lawrence, and I do not want to spend another day without you. If you will have me, I want to stand by your side forever." She paused, her voice softening but remaining steady. "Lawrence Gray, will you marry me?" A single tear slipped down Lawrence's pale cheek, catching the light like a diamond, as he looked down at the woman who had brought so much warmth into his cold, lonely world. He had lived 100 years believing he was a monster, but in her eyes, he saw only his true self. "Yes, Hazel," he said, his voice rough with emotion, yet clear enough to echo through the yard. "I will." The townspeople erupted into cheers and applause, their old fears replaced by a deep respect for the couple, who had shown them the true meaning of courage. In the years that followed, the stone house on the hill was no longer a place of shadows, but a home filled with laughter, warmth, and the love of a family. The townspeople of Silverton grew to look up to Lawrence as their true leader, a king who ruled with a quiet, generous heart rather than fear. Hazel stood on the stone terrace one evening, watching the golden sun dip below the mountain peaks, feeling the cool, steady hand of her husband wrap around hers as they looked toward their future together. Life has a way of leading us through the coldest storms, only to bring us to the place where we truly belong. We often spend our days looking for warmth in the familiar, fearing the things we do not understand. Yet, the greatest acts of love are often found in the quiet corners of the world, hidden beneath appearances that frighten the crowd. True courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to look past the surface and see the beauty of a gentle soul. And when we find that soul, we must hold on to it, knowing that a true home is not built of stone, but of the kindness and faith we share with the ones who keep us safe. Looking back, she knew that the path that had led her to this valley had been filled with pain, but every cold step had been worth the journey. We often spend our lives searching for a love that is perfect and easy, believing that happiness can only exist in the bright, familiar places of the world. But the truest love is often found in the quietest shadows, hidden beneath a surface that the world does not understand, waiting for someone with the courage to look deeper. It is the kindness that stands firm in the middle of a storm, the loyalty that protects us when we are weak, and the quiet devotion that remains long after the sun has set. Those are the things that build a real home. And as she leaned her head against Lawrence's shoulder, Hazel knew that their love would endure, a gentle light guiding them through the shadows of all the years to come.